So a few days ago, Fortune Cookie 45LC put out a shooter's coffee chat asking the question, what's the gun you've shot the most? He indicated in there that the gun we've shot the most isn't always our favorite gun, but the one that we've shot the most, there's always stories behind it. And so he did a little video on his. A couple other people have done some videos as well. I thought I'd take Fortune Cookie up on his invitation to sit down with a cup of coffee and tell a story or two about my particular gun that I've shot the most. I grew up on the edge, right on the edge of fish and game land, and so as a kid I ended up with a wrist rocket, kind of that slingshot that has the brace that goes across the wrist. And I practiced and practiced and practiced with that thing, and finally one day it all came together, and I knocked down a lot of critters and birds and targets and dirt clumps, and anything that was within range was in danger. A couple years later, I ended up acquiring a little BB gun. If I remember right, it was one of those 760 Pump Masters. And it was the same exact experience as that wrist rocket, except that the projectile was smaller and the range was a little bit further. But as I grew up and matured a bit, also known as I had a little more money and little parental oversight, I moved on to actual firearms. Now, if you were to ask me right now my favorite gun, or if I could only have one gun, which one would I reach for? Today, right now, that would be the Smith & Wesson Model 29. This is the 6.5-inch barrel, a la Dirty Harry. This is an outstanding revolver, an outstanding firearm, and it is so versatile. You can shoot anything from 150 to 300 grain bullets in this. You can shoot anywhere from 500 to 1500 feet per second with this. It is a lot of fun. It is extremely capable. And while this may currently be my favorite gun, this is not my most used. I didn't acquire this until just a few years ago. My most used gun is another all-black evil gun. It's a Taurus Model 66 357 Magnum, a 7-shot revolver, and this one has a 4-inch barrel. If we get this just right, you should be able to see the 357 Magnum marking on there. And this one is a 7-shooter, not a 6-shooter. So this is very much like several of the Smith & Wesson revolvers. This one I believe would be equivalent to an L frame. And that 357 is the gun that I have shot the most, without a doubt. I bought this 66 several years ago, right after I returned to college after being stationed overseas. Priorities, you know, I took the student loan money and I had to buy myself a hunting rifle. I had to buy myself a 12 gauge. I knew I needed a 9mm, and I found the cheapest one I could find, and that's the High Point that I've shown you recently. I bought a little concealable handgun, and I knew I needed a 357 mag revolver. This revolver is the very first gun that I started reloading for, that and my 243 rifle. And it's the first gun that I started casting bullets for. I think every bullet I've ever cast for this revolver has been the Lee 358-158 RF. And when I first started casting, I wasn't powder coating. And I still have some of those that were traditionally lubed, that I loaded in 357 Magnum cases, as well as I load a lot of them in 38 Special. And in my recent hollow point test, you've seen me take the hollow point version of that same bullet and use it in these gel blocks back here. Now, whenever I have gone deer hunting, or elk hunting, I've had that on my side, even though I've taken the rifle as the primary, until recent years where I started archery hunting as well. That revolver has stayed on my side. When I first started loading, as I said, it was this gun I was loading for, and I purchased some 158 grain Spear Gold Dot hollow points, and that's the primary bullet I was loading for it. But I also picked up some of these Spear plastic shot shell capsules, and I loaded them up with some number 8 shot. And one of the very first times I took this revolver out to test my hand loads, I went out to this canyon, and the little parking area in this canyon was really small and narrow, and the canyon opened way back behind it, and there was mule deer back there, there were whitetail there were coyotes there, there was cougar back there. There was a lot of game back in that area. But I was just heading in there to test some hand loads and set up a couple targets there near the parking area. As I was setting up the targets and I was about to fire my first shot through this, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. And I looked over, and there was a little rabbit over there. And I thought, hey, let's see if this thing is sighted in. I actually had this one of those Spear 158 grain bullets. I had some factory rounds loaded in there to check my point of impact, point of aim first. And so I thought, hey, that rabbit's sitting right at 50 yards. What better target to see if I'm actually sighted in? So I bore down on that rabbit, I pulled the trigger, and that rabbit just flopped. And as I approached that rabbit, I thought, man, that's a colorful rabbit. It was a real white bunny with these big brown spots all over it. And as I got closer and closer, I thought, that doesn't seem like just the typical rabbit you'd see out in the bushes here. And when I picked it up, it had a name tattooed inside of its ear. I had a buddy that went out and shooting in that same area a couple days later, and he and his friends found 2 or 3 more rabbits with their names tattooed in their ear. I think what happened is probably some kid with his 4-H project was raising bunnies, and Mom decided she got tired of taking care of them and dropped them off out there so they could live the rest of their lives out in a peaceful nature. But I was also near a vet school, and I wasn't sure what sort of experiments may have been run on those things or what was going on. And so normally I would have eaten that thing, but that one I left for the coyotes to eat. I was pretty impressed with myself to grab this thing, not having owned it very long, and shoot a rabbit at 50 yards. There was another time I was deer hunting with that same buddy that I mentioned, and we were on a pretty steep hill, a butte, and he was down below me. And the hillside was pretty open, but it had large patches of brush and some trees, and he actually spooked this little buck that came running straight up the hill and came running by me. And I swung on that deer as it went running by with my 30-06, and I pulled the trigger, and I saw it kick. I knew I'd hit it. And that deer ducked into some of the thickest brush you've ever seen. And as I went looking for that deer, I could hear it. And I thought, based on the way it was breathing and the noise that it was giving off, that I had shot it through the lungs. And so we waited a couple minutes. I thought it would expire pretty soon. But we kept hearing that sucking noise as it would breathe. And the brush it was in was too thick for me to take my 30-06 rifle in there. So I took this out of the holster and went walking in. And as soon as I entered that brush, that deer took off running. It didn't go very far. It jumped into a very similar but larger pile of brush, and we could still hear it. And so we followed it in there. And again, that brush and the trees were too thick for me to take my rifle in there. So I walked in there with this 357. The only avenue of approach I had to that deer, all I could see was its backside. And every once in a while it would pick its head up and look at me and put its head right back down. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Texas heart shot, if you will, but it was getting dark, and as we were looking for this deer, we realized we might not be on public land. I'm still not sure about that. I think we were on public land, but I can't swear to it. So finally, I took that only shot that I had through its backside. The bullet exited. That deer jumped up. It ran about 20 feet, collapsed, and as I approached it this time, it was curled up with its legs underneath it, and it presented me a perfect broadside shot. And I'll go ahead and throw a couple pictures in here. If you don't like seeing pre-processed meat, I'd say look away for a minute or two. But here you can see the hole in its neck where that 30-06 just barely got the front of his neck and hit his windpipe. And then if you look at at the deer's left shoulder, that's the exit wound from the 357 from this. And I actually still have that bullet. When I gutted that deer out and then processed it, the bullet fell out. It entered one side, just barely clipped a rib, went all the way through, broke a rib on the far side, and then blew a large hole in the shoulder. There was another year that I was hunting whitetail in Alabama, and I was in a tree stand over a green field. And in Alabama, at least then, I haven't checked in several years, but then you could shoot 2 deer a day, but only one could have antlers. And I watched this large doe and a yearling walking around for about 45 minutes, and she started to get spooked. And so I shot, and she ran off of the green field into the CRP next to it, and just collapsed after a step or two, and shot her with a rifle. 10 minutes later, more than a dozen deer showed up on that field. And as I waited for something to show up that had antlers on it, that never happened. And so as the sun was about to set, I put the crosshairs on one of the doe and squeezed the trigger. I also leaned into the rifle and closed my eyes, and I shot a good foot underneath the belly of that deer. It was a clear miss. And that resulted in an entire field full of deer running in circles, not sure what was going on or what direction to go. And a lot of them ended up disappearing in the trees behind me. I was sitting up in a tree stand. But a couple of the deer stopped directly underneath me, and as I looked down, they were standing right next to the ladder to that stand, and they were staring back into the field trying to figure out what was going on. Well, I had this in my lap. And so I just leaned down, put the sights right on the vital area of one of those doe, and pulled the trigger. And that deer jumped straight up in the air, landed on its feet, took one step, fell over, and it was done. And it was off to the butcher with both doe. I had this on my side as well while I was out elk hunting, and was able to shoot the head off of a forest grouse that was up under a tree, and that was a really good tasting bird. And then about the time I started casting bullets, I had a gun range not too far from the house, and they offered some Steel Challenge and a couple other shooting leagues. And these are the 2 revolvers I shot with. Now, most of my shots prior to that, I think, had been in single action. I never had an issue. But I discovered during Steel Challenge that I've got a small problem with this revolver. I don't know if it developed over time or it was always there and I just never noticed. I never have a problem shooting single action. But if I shoot double action, every once in a while I'll get light primer strikes. And so I still need to take a look at this. I think it's something to do with the spring in here. That is the hammer return spring. I've read a couple things, talks about possibly modifying that spring to fix that issue. That's something I still need to get into. But that revolver right there has spent a lot of time on my side and then a lot of time in my hand. It's put meat in my freezer and meat on my table, and I've had a lot of good times with that revolver. Again, right now, if I could only have one gun, it'd be this 44. But a good .357 mag revolver would be a very close second. You know, speaking of .357 mag revolvers, coffee's done. Chat has to be about done. There's a channel y'all need to check out. It's called Tactical Advantage TV, I believe. The actual YouTube name is TATV Canada. He just posted a great video about changing the springs in a Smith & Wesson 686. He puts out very high quality, very well done videos, and he covers topics like, you know, casting, reloading, accessories. He's got an outstanding series where he's running lead hardness tests to figure out changes in BHN over the course of time. The only thing I don't understand about his channel, other than the aboots and agains, is why he still has less than 200 subscribers. I'll post a link to his channel in the description here. Go say hey, tell him Bacon sent you. Anyway, coffee's done, so chat's done. Thanks for hanging out. I hope you all enjoyed your coffee. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks for watching, and God bless.